Hello and welcome to this special interview with Mr. Brian DOOLEY, the Senior Advisor of Human Rights First and member of the Advisory Board of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. Hello and welcome, Mr. Brian.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. Bahrain's parliamentary and municipal elections ended a while ago. In your study, which was published in the Pond, you described it as the elections of shame and talk about the absence of an independent committee to manage it without bias. Why did you call it the elections of shame? Are the elections legitimate in the absence of censorship?
So the elections are basically fake. There was a process, and people went and voted. But, people who wanted to stand, who legitimately ought to have been allowed to stand for Parliament, weren't allowed to. Apart from the opposition not being allowed to stand and really being suffocated, not being even allowed to exist as opposition groups. There is no independent media allowed in Bahrain. And so no, I think by any rational standard, those elections are fake and yes, shameful really.
Before the elections, you advised the United States not to praise the false elections in Bahrain. Do you think the United States has praised Bahrain after the elections?
The Trump administration seems really not to care so much about what's happened in Bahrain or the other Gulf states, as long as they are part of the alliance against Iran.
Well, do you think the arming deals are part of this praising?
Yes, although, let's be clear, the arms deals aren't new. I mean, arms deals went on way before Trump and way before Obama too. So arms deals, I think, are interesting in that, of course, there is the practicalities, the hardware of weaponizing a dictator, but it's also just as significantly, really, a signal of political support. If we're willing to sell you arms, that was slightly different under Obama, at least for a while. But the Trump administration has really lifted any sort of human rights type restrictions on that.
Okay. Well, day after day, Bahrain applies the law of political isolation against the opposition. Al-Wifaq and Wa'ad have not been allowed to participate in the elections. Can a parliament move forward without opposition? Is it possible for democracy to exist without opposition?
I think the damage that the elections and then the parliament can do is to give the impression internationally that there is, if not full democracy, there is some intention at least to be on the pathway to progress to democracy. I think that's the danger with the elections and the fake parliament, that it might persuade some people that not everything is bad. That the ruling family are prepared to tolerate some sort of criticism, and that's just not true.
What are the options of opposition in the future under the law of political isolation, in your opinion? And what's your message to Wa'ad and to Al-Wifaq specifically?
Really, I'm very reluctant as somebody who is not Bahraini, who sits thousands of miles away from Bahrain, to give any advice to anybody in Bahrain. Particularly dissidents on how they ought to try and oppose the government. I mean, clearly, it's virtually impossible for them to operate.
So they have no options,
legally.
you think?
Well,
or options are limited?
Their options are very limited, I think. What some of the big international actors were looking for in previous years was some show of an indication of how popular these opposition groups were. And I think it was very difficult for the opposition groups to show that they had the backing of the people when they weren't allowed to protest, they weren't allowed to organise properly. Even if they did go into elections, the elections were rigged against them. So I think they're in a much worse position than they were a few years ago, but were it possible to organise some sort of peaceful mass protest, whether it's a general strike or something milder than that, I think that would get the attention of the big international players.
Okay. Opposition leader Sheikh Ali Salman was sentenced to life imprisonment instead of verdict of innocence. How would you describe this trial? What considerations, in your opinion, prevent Washington from acting in a clear and transparent manner to stop this unfair trial because of a mediation it was a partner in?
I'm not sure that Washington isn't being clear and transparent. I think it's pretty clear that Washington just doesn't care. In addition, would be better would be for the American authorities to say, look, we were at this trial. It clearly was an unfair trial, a kangaroo court. You can't convict somebody on that basis. And I'd say with a more general point too, on these sentences, whether it's 5 years for Nabil or life imprisonment for Ali Salman. You know, in one sense, that's just a number on a piece of paper, because we know that the judiciary isn't independent. The legal system really is in the pocket of the ruling elite. And so whether you're sentenced to 5 years or life imprisonment or 18 months, you will be released when they want you to be released, not when the sentence is out.
They'll get you back when they want you back in prison.
So, you know, if Nabil, if they decide that either there's so much pressure or that it's somehow in their interest to have Nabil released before 5 years, then they'll simply let him go. And at the end of 5 years, if they decide they don't want to let him go, then no question, they'll just invent some new process and charges for him to be put in. Yeah.
So what's the message for the Bahrain king?
This can't be in the country's interest or even your own interest. Like, how do you want your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to grow up? This path that you're following is very dangerous, and we've seen it. You know,
Yeah, we've seen many models.
Not just across the region, but across the world. That
throughout history as well.
If you repress the public so severely and for such a long time, in the end, there's a major reaction. And wouldn't it be better for you, for your grandchildren, to reform now while you can?
Exactly.
I mean, the window on that is
especially when the position is allowing or giving a chance for dialogue.
Well, you know, the king and those around him really need to think more long term. I think, you know, beyond 5 years or 10 years, or really even what happens after they've gone. Do they want to pass this legacy on to their children, and beyond that the only way that you can maintain power is to rule by fear?
After a previous attempt by you to visit the imprisoned human rights activist Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja in Bahrain, you were detained and denied entry, as you before explained, and you considered that Bahrain was an outlawed police state. Are you really a security risk?
I don't think so. No, I went to Bahrain last April with a member of parliament from Denmark, and when we were refused entry, we asked why, and they said that you're a security risk, and we said, what do you mean? And they said national security. Clearly, I'm not a national security risk. I'm not there to either want to or have the capability of, you know, damaging Bahrain security. But that level of paranoia, I think, all sounds a little bit unstable to be accusing members of parliament from Europe of being a national security risk.
Will you try to visit Bahrain?
Yeah.
Okay, good. In an earlier article in the Huffington Post, you talked about the United States could do about discrimination against the Shiites in Bahrain. Can Washington take a step in this context?
Yes. Yeah.
So why do you think the discrimination exists?
Because it can, I think. I think again, I'm not in the mind of the ruling family and those around them, but clearly they regard much of the majority Shia population as somehow adversarial or a threat to them. In terms of discrimination, is access to employment for Shias in certain parts of the government. You know, stereotypically they've been allowed and encouraged to go into the areas of health and education, but not into the security forces or not into the treasury or any of the big deal political stuff. You know, I know from seeing myself, previous experience, that security forces which are drawn almost exclusively from one sect are necessarily then problematic for, like in Northern Ireland, right? During the 1980s, there was a Catholic population in Northern Ireland of about 40%, but only 8% of the police were Catholic. And it meant all sorts of things that, you know, that large part of Northern Ireland regarded the police, you know, at best as not representing them and at worst as being, you know, the enemy. And so I think that Washington can use its influence, African Americans, more people of color into the police force, and that's a hard step to take. I understand that.
Well, do you expect the possibility of a political settlement in Bahrain?
I'm reluctant to predict that, you know, the Bahraini regime can last, you know, another year or 5 years or 10 years or whatever, because when this change happens, it happens like really, I mean, within days or weeks, you know.
After a few days, specifically on 14th of February, the Bahrainis will commemorate the memory of their peaceful revolution. A message from you to the opposition and to those people who have maintained their peaceful revolution throughout this period, despite the repression machine that's hunting them.
You know, those people who continue to resist peacefully really are a remarkable example, not only to other people in Bahrain, but across the world. I mean, this is year after year, and in some sense, decade after decade of harsh authoritarianism, and that people still stick to principles of non-violence, and they still protest at all in the very limited ways they can. When I talk about other countries, or I talk about human rights struggles in other countries, I refer to Bahrain as an example of many, many good things in terms of how human rights movement can develop and how it can evolve and how it can do international advocacy and how it can get international media. There's a lot to learn from the Bahraini experience for other people looking for freedom too.
And the opposition?
An expert on the various dynamics between opposition factions or figures. You know, something that I've learned really from, primarily from South Africa, is if your political leaders are in prison, it can be very useful to then publicly acknowledge that and to hold these people up as leaders of civil society or as leaders perhaps of the political opposition. And I think they have a great legitimacy. So whether dissidents in prison in Bahrain can get it together to propose ideas, to work in coalition, I don't know. I know it's not easy, but I think that would be useful.
Well, we have reached the end of our interview. Mr. Brian, thank you very much
Thanks a lot
for participating. That's it for now. Dear viewers, thank you for watching.